Franny.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And Stacey does send her apologies. She just really couldn't be here today last minute and she feels terribly. So I wanted to make sure to pass that along. But I'm happy to be here and to be with you all. I see some familiar names and it's nice to put some faces with them. So um, as Sonia said, I'm Franny Kahan. I'm the Cultural Arts Manager and I direct the film festival at the JCC. I have been there for over 4 years now, and I think that's 5 festivals, just based on the timing of when I started. It's a pleasure to have the film festival as one of my sort of large projects in my arts portfolio at the J. Um, but also the festival goes back so quite a number of years. I think we're over 30 years running. Um, Started as a volunteer driven program, sort of housed at the Federation, I believe. And then I think over 10 years ago now, it's been a program at the JCC. And it kind of shifted to a volunteer committee, which is very involved in the festival planning and process. But I am the staff person, sort of that facilitates and works to kind of execute on it as a program of the JCC. So it's a great collaboration and a great community-focused program, and we're very glad to be able to keep it running and offer it to the community every year, especially this past year with all that has gone on and continues to go on, actually. But in terms of the committee process and how it works at the JCC, it has grown really. The committee is now about 15 strong. And then, with my role on it, I'm sort of a 16th voice that acts. I don't see myself as a committee member exactly, but I definitely, participate in the committee aspect. And I'm also a staff member of the J. So I represent sort of that voice as well. Um, and that perspective. But so we have, 15 members. I don't know the exact number it started at, but I think it started at maybe around a handful and then it grew over the years. And that's also true, I think, for, as Sonia said, the size of the festival, the number of films. It started smaller than where it is today. And this year, was a little bit different. But still, I think, a rather full festival. I think we had 10 feature titles this year. I think the highest we've had that I'm aware of is 14 just a couple years ago, 14 feature films. And the number of short films varies year to year, kind of depending on the layout and the type of programming we're doing. Sometimes we pair short films with feature films like we did this past year. And then a couple of years ago, we did a night of short films, which we'd been talking about on the committee for quite a while and felt that the short films that year really merited sort of their own night of programming. So the committee process, it is an investment. These are volunteer committee members. They spend many hours viewing films, discussing films, brainstorming festival, and then hosting the festival itself. You'll often see when we're in person a lot of committee members in their t-shirts for that year, sharing information, welcoming attendees at the different venues. Obviously, we had fewer visible members on your screens this year, just logistically. A virtual festival is a different animal. So, but everyone was grateful, I think, to participate again this year and be able to host the festival, host a full festival, and not sort of a very pared down type of event. So a lot of effort on their part went into it. But so a lot of hours starting sort of usually in the spring or early summer. We'll meet usually once a month. And we'll begin our review process sort of around that time, and it'll run through early fall usually. That's when we have sort of our discussions. So we have a lineup of or excuse me, a list of films, different titles in sort of a feature short film category breakdown. We'll often discuss some other types of titles as well, making sure that we're open to all different types of opportunities and possibilities for the festival. Those titles are collected based on research, based on titles we're hearing about on the festival circuit, all sorts of different ways of collecting sort of information, and then we'll try to vet them. We'll do a committee review process, like I said, that lasts for most of the year. So lots of film watching during that time period. Committee members watch at their own pace. Right now we have a process where sort of everyone's on their own timing, what works best for their schedule. And then we, consistently meet, and then sort of have deadlines throughout the process to make sure that we're on track and collecting the information so we're ready for discussions, and to have some kind of data about viewing. We have, I believe right now we have 5 views per title to have a full discussion, to make sure there are varied voices that are sharing. If you have one person that likes it and one person that hates it, that's not always that productive. So we like to have different voices. So in the discussion, we can have, a deep conversation about the content, the quality of the film, and for sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But for our discussions, we have a rating system that we implement, and there's sort of different areas of criteria, like I was mentioning. But we use that so that we can have some kind of numbers. Obviously, they're not, everything's subjective, so they're not the most sort of empirical always, because there's lots of opinion that's kind of behind those numbers, but we use those as a foundation so we can kind of make sense and guide our conversations, because we could talk for hours and hours, which we do, but it helps us a little bit. So we do have some processes in place. We have a document that sort of guides us in terms of our mission, what our objectives are, and then our processes, so that we have structure to what we're doing. Keeps us sort of on track. There are responsibilities for committee members and responsibilities for myself as the staff member, on what we're committing to are participating in this project. And we have different criteria that we look at when we're thinking about film selection. Obviously, there are so many factors, right? And so we do like to think about genre. We like to have a balance, although for the Jewish and Israeli sort of content niche that we're in for our festival, there are a lot of dramas and a lot of documentaries from year to year. You can usually bet on those categories being sort of the heavier of the selection. Comedies and romance tend to be a little more difficult to come by. If you do have them, often there's some difficulty, especially with comedies, if they're an Israeli comedy, of translating. Humor can be very specific, culturally specific. Sometimes you don't always get the inside jokes, or it doesn't quite appeal, right, to the same, to the different groups. And so that's always something that we have a hard time with, honestly, because we usually, kind of get rid of, say, these comedies aren't very good. They won't appeal to our audience. So that does narrow down the options quite a bit. So that does explain a little bit of the drama and documentary heaviness in the festival, which you might see. It's pretty consistent from year to year, which, there's still great quality of film. It's just the genre is a little bit harder to balance. And then we, obviously quality is important. We think content is important. We try to aim for some kind of balance as much as we can. And we think partnership, with community organizations, community groups is really important. And also programming. One of our goals is, an educational objective. So that is a really important thing, and that really speaks to the programming, the speakers that we can bring in, and the panels, especially from this year, that you might um, have front of mind. But so all of those are really important factors, and there's also budgetary and scheduling considerations that are always a part of everything. So that does play a big factor sort of in our in what decisions we're able to make. So that's a little bit of behind the scenes. I would guess I turn to 2021. So this year's festival, like we were talking about, definitely a little bit different than normal years. We weren't sure what this year was going to be like. We started our meetings, sort of last spring of 2020, which is when everything was sort of the most uncertain, I would say. It was sort of we finished our 2020 in-person festival at the end of February. We sort of do our wrap-up meeting. We usually celebrate a little bit. We have a meal together as a committee, and then we take a month or two off, and I'll work on our lists and try to do some preparations for the next festival cycle, and then we start meeting usually. So that wasn't the exact same feeling. Beginning of March, kind of crazy times for everyone. And we started meeting virtually. I think we started in May in 2020. We started meeting virtually, kind of looking forward to and thinking about and hopefully eventually planning for 2021. And we had a lot of conversations about some of the different challenges, some of the options, and what we wanted to do. And our goal from the beginning was always to have the festival. It's an annual festival. We didn't want to miss a year. And we felt fortunate that we had finished our 2020 festival successfully and had a bit more time. There are some festivals, there are Jewish and Israeli festivals, different varieties of festival across the country, across the world. So we're one of many that were sort of dealing with this specific challenge. And there were some festivals that were in the middle of their festival. There are some festivals that, were going to take place in the spring. So they were in a much more difficult position, I would say, just with the amount of time to make decisions and pivot and, do a quick turnaround. So we were able to kind of spend more time gathering information, seeing what other festivals were doing, talking with colleagues at other festivals and institutions. And so as we sort of were reviewing, some films were taken off the festival circuit. Some films went to streaming early, which is a trend that's happening quite a bit. There are some there are a lot of films that want to do the festival circuit because it's a way of reaching community. It's a way of supporting and connecting with the community. And so there's a lot that's a mindset that's of that vein. But there are some films that might be of interest that go to streaming pretty quickly, or that we don't quite have the ability to show in our festival just because of the timing, with it being if we're hoping for a film that we're starting to review in spring of 2020, it might, be already to streaming or in theaters, 5 months, 6 months later. So it'll be before our festival takes place. So those are factors, like I was saying, with scheduling, just with some of our process. We do our best to kind of make sure we have a full list of to consider. But so, like I was saying, we had some time. So we were reviewing some films were taken off the festival circuit. Unfortunately, some films were sort of stuck in production and weren't able to be completed. And so we're hoping, for those in the future. Everyone was affected in different ways. But the more we were reviewing and the more we were planning, we decided to pivot fully to virtual. To make sure that everyone was safe, to make sure we could offer the program, but in a way that would be best for the community. So that was quite an undertaking. We found a platform. There were several, but we found one that fit sort of our circumstances and our needs. And we moved forward with that. A lot of specifics and texts and coordination and things to make it all happen. But we were very happy to be able to put on a fully virtual festival at our normal time in sort of the winter, and to offer a full festival a little bit smaller than what we might normally do, but a full festival, that had some diversity in type of film, content, and that did offer the type of programming that we like to build into as sort of a value add into the festival. So I guess to talk about some of the specifics. So our bookends, we call them our sort of bookends, our opening and our closing types of programs and films. Those are always ones that we, hope are strong and entertaining and a positive experience. So we decided to do our opening as a more social event, something a little more entertaining and not film specific. So we had a custom cocktail for our festival. We did a cocktail demo, and we had an Israeli film and TV talk by a film lecturer who joined us several years ago, and she was really wonderful and popular sort of with our community. So she was gracious enough to stay up very, 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 very late in Tel Aviv in the middle of the night for us, because she's very kind. And she did a wonderful job, I think, kind of, priming us on Israeli cinema, on Israeli humor, on Israeli society, all these things that kind of come up in film and TV, no matter what culture you're in. You see reflections and representations of things going on in society. And so we learned a bit from her. And then we had sort of our festival sort of kicked off by that event. We had film viewing windows, and then we had special events connected, sort of grounded in the films, whether they were with film directors or figures that were featured in films, or whether they pulled the content out of the film and spoke to some of the things represented in the film, some of the issues that were talked about. So we felt that with the geo blocking, which is sort of this thing that happens when you switch to virtual. If you're in person, people can come to your venue and watch your film. The people that want to drive there, great. The people that you serve in your community, they'll be there. But when you're on the internet, like many of you have experienced, you can tune into all sorts of events all over the country, all over the world. It's great. It's convenient. It's fun. But there are kind of a variety of factors that kind of came up with distributors who help kind of, promote films and get them into different festivals and showing in different places, and also with all the different festivals that take place. So there's this thing called geo-blocking, which helps limit access to certain areas. Some of that is requirements when you make an agreement to show a film. Some of that is, trying to serve your population and not cannibalize sort of across festivals. So it's a little bit complicated, sort of navigating all of that. But that did come up for many of our films. We had them sort of held to the tri-state so we could serve our population. And then we had some that reached further. But for our programming, for our speakers, we wanted to make sure that we could try to serve as many in the community as we could. So we left those so they could be accessed even if you couldn't watch the film. And so we built those to have their own legs a little bit more, sort of more standalone programs. Obviously, super helpful if you've seen the films, because a lot of them, connect and speak to what is shown in the films. But usually when you go to a festival, you've been there in the theater for an hour and a half, maybe a couple hours, depending how long the film is. And some people are really invested and want to hear the speakers and want to participate in sort of a conversation where they can reflect on the film and learn a little bit more. And some people have been there for 2 hours and they're ready to go home. They're tired, they want to go to bed. So we try not to have our additional programming in a normal year be too long, because we don't want to hold you there for an extra hour and have it be like a 3-hour event. We don't think that that's, anything that anyone really wants to do. And so this year, with having a little bit more flexibility with the viewing windows for the films and with the viewing windows for the live events and then the recording of them being accessible, we decided to have them be a little bit more of a standalone. So the programs were usually 45 minutes to an hour, maybe an hour and a half for opening or closing that were more standalone events. Um, and we were able to build out the programs a bit more because we had more time. So we could have fuller conversations, bring in more voices. And with it being virtual, we were able to grab people, and bring them into the festival that may not have been able to fly here and be with us if we had been in person. So in that sense, we may have been able to be more successful in sort of building that out because of the virtual nature. So that worked out well, and I'd say that was a success. I think we had a lot of positive feedback, and appreciation for having the festival. I think a lot of people were glad to have some content and to have a familiar event take place, when they were thinking it would, even if it was a bit of a different way than they usually experience. And so we hope that, for those that struggled with technology, I know that I tried to help as much as I could via phone or email. And we had, tech support from the platform itself, which we utilized. So we did our best to make sure that those who wanted to participate could make their way and could access the films and the events. And we did our best. Technology is always a little bit tricky. It doesn't always do what you want it to do, and it can sometimes, be a little confusing. But overall, we didn't have any major issues with tech. Everything worked out pretty well. So we were glad to be able to work through any of those hiccups. So that's a little bit of an overview. I do have a couple of films I'd be happy to kind of share some videos about or speak to, but I'm happy to open up to any questions or things you want to hear more about, or any conversations you want to have.
Let's see, I have a couple questions. First of all, how did the audience compare? I mean, how many people participated?
Yeah, so we don't have exact data. We sold tickets per household this year, since we were doing it virtually,
Right,
sort of based on
household.
device.
Mhm.
Yeah, so our sales were actually higher than expected. I think we didn't quite know how to gauge interest. Obviously, there's a lot of virtual content in the world right now, and there's also a decent amount of fatigue, I would say, for doing online programming. So. We weren't sure exactly how it would fare, but we had great interest. We feel like we had a lot of new participants, like they participated for the first year, and it looks like some of that might be because of the virtual nature. It allowed for more flexibility, and so people took advantage of that. And we also had a really big increase in terms of interest in festival passes versus individual tickets. And I think that was also because of the virtual nature and, more flexibility in terms of your schedule, potentially being home more. So you'd have, a little bit more of an easier time attending more programs than if you had to drive across the city, every other night or something for the festival.
Before I ask another one, do any of you have some good questions to ask? You can unmute yourselves.
Yeah, I found it wonderful to be able to participate from home, and I ended up watching 5 films, whereas if it had been, in the theater, I usually go to maybe 2, maybe 3. So are you going to continue next year, even when you can have them in person, having an option to do it virtually?
Well, thank you so much for your support. First of all, I know several of you did participate and have for years, so thank you for your support of the festival. We are trying to start having conversations about that. If you took our survey, our emailed survey, we did ask that question, several questions, but ask that question about, you know, your response sort of to the virtual platform, to the virtual nature, to the virtual option, trying to get a sense of, how we can build the festival and continue to build the festival to serve the community. There is an interest in sort of some kind of hybrid option. I'm not exactly sure what that will look like at this point. And, there's a lot of factors that go into that, but the committee, is already sort of starting to talk about, we'll talk about it more as we begin the 2022 committee cycle in a couple months. We just wrapped for the 2021 committee. And so that'll be a big question. I think our goal is to have a hybrid experience, but we don't know how that'll be structured, and we'll need to make sure that our resources are able to do that. But definitely, definitely the big item sort of on our.
And the thing I thought would be, I mean, just an idea, but that in terms of hybrid, those panels and the wraparound events that, that very often were scheduled after the film or sometimes before. You could see it before or after. That would be great to have online. I mean, even to whip up interest in actually going to see the film. Because, I think obviously to stream it online, the movie, would be an added expense. I'm sure it's a different license. So economically probably couldn't do that for all the movies, but to do the panels, or something like that, or even, promos, like, for example, the one on sustainability, that was so cool to have those local people talking about what they were doing. And that just blew my mind. So anyway, I just thought.
There were really wonderful speakers who lent their expertise, and we're very grateful. And it'll be sort of all those different factors coming together to see what we can do to make sure it's hopefully a great experience in 2022. So.
Herb, you were gonna.
I was just gonna say the one on water. I mean, Adrienne Parr was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen her before, and she was at the University of Cincinnati and has moved on. So we had an opportunity to see some of her presentations a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think she actually did better here in this situation, but it was just really fantastic to see that again.
Well, we're glad you were there, and thank you for the kind words. I thought that there were so many incredible speakers, but I thought that conversation, how it tied to the film and then sort of expanded, was just really wonderful to see them sort of interact and
she's
build on each other.
Adrienne's very into that sort of thing. She's very experienced in doing that, and that showed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Other comments? Bobby, unmute.
Yeah. Were you limited in the number of choices because of films being sort of stopped in the middle, or was the selection of what was out there limited in any way by the pandemic?
There was some effect. Just how I mentioned, some of the films were pulled, so they were no longer booking showings at festivals for some of the titles. Some of the titles were on track to finish, and we would be able to consider them, but then delays occurred and they weren't able to. So there was some influence. I would say, overall, we still had a selection. We still had, a number of films that we were sort of choosing from, but there's different factors every year, and COVID definitely was a factor. It was a sort of an unexpected factor that became part of our process. So, yeah. But also, I guess, to speak to some of the content, we, as a committee, discuss the different options, and there are conversations about what should be represented and what we can, put forward into the community. But I think we see one of our main roles is to create conversation, to create dialogue, and to engage people in topics that are relevant to what's going on. And I think especially with what has happened over the last year. There were different topics that we felt were really important, and the films that were available were really important to include. So there were, obviously there was the film about the environment. There were conversations about race. So there was a lot in there, depending on what you were viewing.
Kids, the infertility. I mean, there were really, the one on infertility, which was the comedy, really was so Israeli. I mean, that was like, you could really see the contrast between our society and Israeli society on a very, human and Jewish issue. So that was pretty profound, for a comedy.
Yeah, no, there's some light moments, but obviously, infertility and the struggles that can come along with that are very serious. And in the panel, I think they spoke very thoughtfully and with a lot of sort of I would say like experience and knowledge in those areas, whether it's through their research or personal experience. And the Jewish Fertility Foundation was our partner on that film. And, they do a lot of great work, in that area with families experiencing infertility. And so that was I think, a really wonderful conversation, because it did kind of talk about sort of Israel and America and the different populations that live and how they experience it, and healthcare and all these different factors that play a part.
Yeah, so many issues. I mean, it was like a film that, boy, that would have been great to discuss in person, to have the ability to talk about all those societal issues. And
right.
Bobby, unmute.
It was just so Israeli. And, I mean, for that, I mean, I've lived in Israel. It was just so, the reactions of the family members and the reactions of the other men who were going through this. I mean, it was so Israeli. And, so, I mean, in addition to giving, an insight into the struggles with infertility, it also gave a real insight into Israeli society and family dynamics, and it was just.
Do you think that some of the reactions are not present in the United States or different? I mean, certainly, I think the difficulties in extended families in dealing with the issue when a couple within the extended family has this problem exist in the United States. And I mean, there's all kinds of busybodiness also in America. I think in Israel, maybe it's more in your face, but I think that
more in your face, and the health within the healthcare system itself, the lack of privacy. There's much more emphasis on privacy. I mean, the way all those guys were lined up there comparing notes, taking. I mean, that I don't know that happens here. It's much more of an individual, private, within the actual healthcare system. The idea of privacy. I mean, the idea of having private rooms in a hospital is relatively new in Israel. I know when we lived there and Stuart was visiting hospitals, I mean, we were climbing over patients' beds so that the doctors could show us the view out the window. I mean, that just wouldn't happen here. It's just a very different approach. The fact that they could 3 beds down hear the fertility doctor's conversation with another family. I mean, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah,
I would say that, I'm sure there's some artistic license in that film. It is a comedy drama. So just to clarify, it is not a documentary, and I know none of you think it is. But I just like to say that I'm not an expert, so I don't feel like I'm really, the right person to comment, but hopefully you were able to hear the conversation with the speakers during the festival. And they were wonderful. And I'm sure,
the speakers were wonderful. And the fact that they were willing to share their experiences. I mean, all of that was really wonderful.
really, really moving. But Jewish Fertility Foundation is a resource in the community, and I'm sure they'd be happy to discuss and offer any sort of insights or information they have. And
Well, and that
I
was,
do know that the director did go through infertility personally, and that's what inspired the film.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I meant to share, we have a digital program book that was available throughout the festival online, but I know that some people might not have seen it. So I was going to share it. There's director statements and different
Yeah, I actually
links
printed it
embedded.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're
It
interested
was
in
really
having,
helpful. Yeah, it was very helpful.
I'll share that in the chat.
see, Sarah, did you want to say something? It looked like you had unmuted yourself.
I was interested. We watched the 2 Hebrew ones, and we were interested in in hearing Hebrew. But the second one that we watched was the one about the woman whose daughter had a degenerative disease, and it was a very wrenching, very sad film. But I thought it was done very well.
Also, that was Hebrew and Russian, and it took me quite a while to figure that out.
Yeah.
What is this language? I don't recognize it.
Yeah, Ozia, definitely a difficult movie, a difficult film, exactly how you said, but sort of really beautiful and bittersweet also. I completely agree.
And also, the young man that helped her out at the end was an Arab, so there was that element too.
Yeah, and actually in the Project Kesher was the organization where the speakers for that special event were from. They work with populations, mostly women and girls in Ukraine, Belarus, different Israel, different communities that really fit with what was sort of represented in that drama. And so they spoke about those communities, and I feel like I learned so much from those 2 women that joined us for the evening. And it gave a lot of insight, I think, into what was represented in terms of different sort of community groups, sort of like Russian and Arabs, and sort of relations there, as well as how the mother was a nurse, sort of working in healthcare, a lot of these different areas, and talked about sort of those communities living in Israel, and gave some insight and background into them, which was really useful, I think, in adding some more layers to understanding the film.
Yeah, I didn't think that the Arabness of the Arab character was developed very much in the plot, which is okay. I mean, it wasn't about him, and there was this other thrust. But when somehow he was introduced as an Arab, I said, they're going to talk about that issue, but they didn't really do it. They did somewhat, but not too much.
I presented him as a compassionate,
Yes.
helpful person, which is positive.
Yeah, I mean, certainly just making that statement is significant.
Yeah.
I think some of that is when I was learning from the speakers, I think some of that is if you're aware of these different relations in Israel between community groups, then you might see more into what was represented on film than, if that was your first exposure. So, if I'm not an expert sort of in these communities, I think there was more, to my reading of the film after we had this conversation than like the first time I watched it potentially. And so I think that's also like one of the great, one of the signs that like, this is a good thing, you're understanding more, hopefully you're learning more, hopefully. And so that's really when I think we can see like the value add in having those types of programs with speakers and conversation.
Oh, yeah. Like, for example, when the film critic, she talked about the band's visit, which I'd seen many times and had been in our film festival, but I had a whole new appreciation for it that I didn't realize when I'd seen it that first time. So yeah, these panels, unfortunately I missed one on Kesher. I didn't see that one for some reason. I don't know. I guess I didn't see the link for some reason, or it wasn't on my calendar.
Everything
Yeah.
blurs together, I think.
It was kind of hard to calendar all these things, there was so much. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little calendar, like add to calendar on each page, which is useful, but there's so many different features. It's hard to navigate.
No, I used that,
new.
but I
Oh,
ended up
that's good.
doing it, but still,
Yeah.
I think I missed that one. Let's see. And how about Herb and Ray or Elaine, Diane, Elaine, any comments?
I have a question about, I have a kind of a personal interest in the short film that went along with the Cantors program called The Torch. I think that was the one that went along with the Cantors.
With the Cantor's Head, I believe it was A Jew Walks into a Bar.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, so then it was the next one.
Yeah, that's okay. So Torch,
The
the
Torch.
short. Yeah.
That was about the
It
know
was
what it-
paired,
father was
I think it was
killed in
paired
a
with The Art of
terrorist
Waiting.
attack. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, how did you come about that? The reason I'm asking is because the young woman who played the girl, and there happens to be the granddaughter of a very good friend of ours.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah, El Sharoni, and yeah. So tell me about how you came upon, because it was a student project for the.
Right. Yeah. Probably the Malay School, I believe. Film and television school.
No.
So I don't remember the exact moment that it was added to the list for consideration. But there are a lot of talented filmmakers. Israel has a great film scene, and there are several sort of schools where film is a focus in Israel, and so there are relationships, sort of between communities, and different distributors also work with those filmmakers and with the schools to help spread the work, the different short films or feature films, depending on what they are. So I think that I can't remember exactly about that film specifically, unfortunately, because it was a little while ago and I don't quite have the recall. But I think that it was something that sounded of interest. It was
Very moving.
a compelling,
well-made
film.
Ears were, oh my gosh, that really got me.
Yeah, but there are a lot of wonderful, I think, especially for final projects, there are a lot of student films that are just very well done, and they kind of launch, I think, a decent number of sort of filmmakers as they're exiting school. So I think that was just one of those films that was maybe being communicated, maybe being shown, making some ripples, and so hopefully, we do some research, we hear about different films, we review them, see if, they might fit into the festival and be a positive addition. Yeah.
Is that in just such a short film, the political situation, the familial, the repercussions on the family, the responsibility. I mean, there's so many things. Such a short film came out so beautifully.
Yeah, well, I was just interested in how a film that was a student project got such wide distribution. I mean, that it made its way to Cincinnati.
Yeah, so actually there are a number of student films that we consider every year, and I think that's just because of the quality of the film schools in Israel and the quality of the work. And if I'm doing research, that might be a source of a place I look to for some interesting films that might enhance the festival. Or if we hear of them from other sources, if a committee member hears of something and says, sends an email, says this title, looks interesting, let's add it, let's look into it. It's kind of how it builds.
Well, Franny, I've got to give you some kudos there then, because, I was on the committee when it was volunteer, and then when it was brought to the JCC, and then we had, very short notice for that. And it was JCC did not start out by supporting it until the current director, really has he bought in and just really pushed it through. So it was a stepchild at first. The first year we had to hold it at the JCC and weren't allowed to use theaters, and had 8 films, and I mean we really had to fight, and we had to do all the research to find films. So much of finding films is developing those relationships
There we go.
with the various distributors. Oh, thank you for coming. So, clearly you've developed those relationships and it's made such a difference. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I know there's
Diana,
a
I
lot
think you
lot
wanted
of-
to say something. Diana, did you?
I have a phone call now, sorry.
Oh,
I was just going to say there's a lot of love and support for the festival, I think, within the J and then from the community. So I think it's a really wonderful situation now, and I hope for many years to come. So.
mhm.
Yeah, do you think that there's going to be a problem getting films for next year because this year's filmmaking has basically been at a standstill?
So I think that was a concern. We talked about it, as a committee. But I think with the timing of sort of our review and selection process and when our festival takes place, there's always sort of a list building no matter what part of the cycle we're in. So I think we have a number of titles we're already sort of looking to kind of dive, deeper into. And then I'm sure more, will come out in the months to come for us to kind of add and consider. I'm sure there's some effect, just like there was, with the 2020 review period leading to the 21 festival. So I'm sure there'll be some effect, but hopefully, some productions already started up again. So hopefully those that were delayed will be able to finish, and maybe they'll be able to be considered for 2022. And then also, I mean, there is the window. We might miss it because films might be released to streaming or all of that, before we're able to consider them. So it kind of, I guess straddles sort of both ways. Hopefully we'll get some more, we might lose some, but yeah, I think we'll be okay.
You still hold to the rule to never screen anything that is available, like on Amazon or.
We make sure that that's a big consideration, just because sort of the nature of the festival and having it, especially with it being online this year, that was a conversation. That's not a hard and fast rule. And I know that it was pretty strict. It's not a hard and fast rule. We make sure that it's, it's sort of a thorough consideration and conversation about what our selection and what our films will be, and that's always a factor. But we have shown some films that have been available, and usually, it's gone. I think it's gone well in terms of we've had support from the community. There might be some savings with a film that is available online, but especially for an in-person festival, it's a very different viewing experience. Viewing it in community, and then also, if we have additional programming with speakers or it's in an event, there's an additional sort of value to that. So I think people appreciate that, and we haven't seen a big impact in terms of if we've made that decision. It has gone well, I would say. So. But no, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I mean, obviously it's a consideration, but we do live sort of in this online world, right? Especially the past year. So it's a factor that's has been sort of on the table for a long time now, and becomes more and more, an item to discuss. So.
Okay. Anyone else?
Anybody else have anything? We're approaching 2:00, so. Okay, so I think, Francis, if you have anything else you want to add?
I'll just say thank you so much for having me on behalf of the committee and the JCC to represent the festival. Thanks for all of your support this year, for past support, for this year, for future support, hopefully. We really appreciate it. And We just announced our fan favorite awards, so
Oh, yeah,
hopefully
I
you
saw
got an
that.
email.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll close with saying that our fan favorite awards, based on feedback from the community, was Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance for our feature film category, and A Jew Walks into Bar, which was our short film category. So I think for those of you that saw them, hopefully you agree, and you feel like your voice was heard. But that was sort of the result after community feedback from balloting and surveys and all of that. So exciting.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you. And I
Thank
hope everything works out for Stacy. Yeah, please convey our thoughts. Okay.
No, thank you so much. I'll let
So-
her know. And thanks again for having me. Stacy wished she could be here, and we hope to see you soon at the movies, hopefully in person.
Great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
Thank you.
Thanks.